All right, so let's dive into part 3 here. We've already looked at the first 2 core components of identity and voice. So let's move into the third, supportive environment. So the culture responsiveness field guide aligns 1.2 as the first feature that aligns with supportive environment, team operating procedures. We know this has to do with teams defining their roles, procedures, and action plan. But what does the elaboration state in the field guide? That those procedures should include structures and practices that prompt the use of data for decision making, right? And so we know this is a core piece so that we have transparency of the system and then enable all stakeholders to have a voice in that process. During the data analysis, team members examine the system and policies for potential changes rather than placing responsibility on families and students. We know this is hard. Some of this feels like it's out of our control, right? Some of those policies and those systems we can't really inform or change. However, we have a defined set of procedures that holds the team responsible for ensuring equitable PBIS implementation and assessing student data for equitable impact. We know that that process we have put in place and that's been defined for teams is the TIPS process, right? Where we know that there's automatically a place in the agenda to review data. And this has been something we've been working on, right? To really improve our data systems and their access to data so that they can review data. So we know that this is an area of growth for us, but having that piece, having that integrated step in that team process where data is automatically a part of how they review implementation of PBIS. Then 1.6, discipline policies. This is a hefty one. This is the next feature aligned with supportive environment. We know this is that proactive and instructive responses, right, to problem behavior. We've combed over this feature so many times and really thought about what can we really inform. But the elaboration states that teams employ and support an instructional approach to discipline that emphasizes teaching of pro-social skills. This is that integration here with SEL, right? And as opposed to using just those exclusionary discipline policies. We examine policies, disciplinary practices for disparate impact and from a power versus purpose perspective. And so what does that mean? That means that instead of looking at policies and practices that reflect the preferences of the staff, we look at those that have a clear purpose linked to educational outcomes. So we know this is our belief. This is what we communicate in trainings with PBIS teams. But, you know, how does this happen in that process? How does this happen when we're sitting with a team, when we guide them to look at instructional approaches and teaching of pro-social skills, when they're asking us about those strategies, right? So how do we guide them to teaching pro-social skills when we look at the data? So this is a part of what this feature speaks to regarding cultural responsiveness. Looking at the next feature they align with supportive environment is 1.9, feedback and acknowledgement, attending to and acknowledging desired behaviors. We know how we focus on this, right? But they speak about it in terms of how we integrate our stakeholders, right? And so how do we pull them in and include them in the development and use of the acknowledgement system so that it's meaningful and authentic, right? And we consider the culture of the students we serve when we design recognition systems. And we understand that the learning of a new skill requires additional reinforcement, particularly when habits are formed or when we have to teach code switching. So when we know students have different expectations in their home or community environments and moving into school where the expectations are different, how do we rely on the teaching and the reinforcement to be able to support the learning of those expectations? So let's reflect here in the next discussion question, reflecting on those last 3 TFI features related to supportive environment. Which aspect do you feel will be the easiest to develop and which do you feel will be the hardest and why? Okay, moving into the next feature that aligns with supportive environment is 1.8, classroom procedures. And this is a hefty one here. And this has quite a bit here, so I'm going to give us some time to take a moment and stop each time and reflect in these discussion threads around some of the pieces just within this feature as it aligns with supportive environment. We know this is our classroom practices, right? But the elaboration states that teams support classroom teachers in the implementation of PBIS in the classroom, that the routines and expectations are taught explicitly, connected to school-wide systems, and students' prior knowledge and home lives. And this is where they state that classroom teachers using the VAB approach, and I'm going to go into that in a minute, ensure that students can see their lives, histories, cultures, and home language incorporated not only into the classroom environment, but also the curricula and the instructional practices on a daily basis. This is a heavy thing here. This is a lot, and we know that we're not doing this across most of our classrooms in Virginia Beach and probably across the nation. But speaking about Virginia Beach, this is not happening in all of our classrooms, right? So what is this VAB approach and what does it look like? The VAB approach stands for validation, affirmation, building, and bridging. So let's try to dive into this and see what we think about this and share a little bit. Validation, affirmation, building, and bridging, as the cultural responsiveness field guide states, is a set of strategies that can be used by staff to facilitate code switching by their students in relation to the students and families served by the school, right? So this is the way to help bridge some of those gaps between the home and community environment and school, right? When there's a bit of a gap between what those expectations might be. So let's dive into each one here, and after each one we'll have a moment to be able to share with each other and kind of reflect on it, okay? So I'm going to give you a minute to read validation. I'm not going to read all of the text. I'll just give you a minute. All right, so here in validation, it's about really legitimizing students' cultures and understanding how important our students' cultures are in their everyday life. And this key point they make here is that the strategies for validation include displaying aspects of students' culture in the classroom and around the school, and asking students to share their experiences and listening non-judgmentally. And in order to do that, students have to be involved. We have to be talking to students, right? So each one of these pieces relies on the other. So as we reflect on this first piece, validation, consider your middle or high school experience. Either one, whichever one you want to reflect on. Did you feel that your culture was validated in class and throughout the school? Okay, let's look at the next one, affirmation. So I'll give you a minute to read this for a second. All right, so they talk about with affirmation that strategies include accepting a wider range of acceptable behavior than the dominant culture often allows. And this is an interesting point here, stating the positive intent of students' behaviors when trying to shape them for situational appropriateness and holding high expectations for each student. So that's a lot right in there, right? So let's take a minute to reflect on that in the next discussion question. Consider the phrase just shared, stating the positive intent of students' behaviors when trying to shape them for situational appropriateness and holding high expectations for each student. So in considering those important pieces they include in that phrase, how can this be integrated into professional learning that we deliver for the 8 classroom practices? So let's take a minute to reflect on that. This is going to be a question that I have us reflect on together for the next few slides. So let's think, how can this concept here, shared in this phrase, be communicated through our training around the 8 classroom practices? Okay, let's look at the next one, building. Providing that specific instruction regarding why the certain student behaviors are necessary in the school setting. But some of those strategies for building include teaching expectations in each setting, right? Instead of assuming students know them, we know this. Teaching code switching, right? How to switch and how to be appropriate for the school environment. And then describing unwanted behaviors as not for school as opposed to just wrong, right? And so let's think in the next discussion question. Let's hone in on this particular phrase. Teaching code switching and describing unwanted behaviors as not for school as opposed to wrong. How can this be integrated into professional learning for the 8 classroom practices? And then let's look at the last one, bridging, giving those opportunities to practice and build fluency. Strategies include those lessons and boosters, right, for active practice of the school behaviors, acknowledging students regularly, and then providing encouraging skill-based non-judgmental correction when needed. So let's look at the next discussion question. Consider the phrase that was just shared, providing encouraging skill-based non-judgmental correction when needed. How can this be integrated into professional learning for the 8 classroom practices?